Chapter 4th, Part 1 of Elsie Dinsmore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Elsie Dinsmore by Martha Finley, Chapter 4th, Part 1. With more capacity for love than earth bestows on most of mortal mould and birth. Byron. What are our hopes? Like garlands on affliction's forehead worn, kissed in the morning, and at evening torn. Davenport's King John and Matilda. Such had been the state of affairs for about a week, when one morning Elsie and her father met at the breakfast-room door. "Good morning, papa," she said timidly. "Good morning, Elsie," he replied, in an unusually pleasant tone. Then, taking her by the hand, he led her in and seated her beside himself at the table. Elsie's cheeks glowed, and her eyes sparkled with pleasure. There were several guests present, and she waited patiently while they and the older members of the family were being helped. At length it was her turn. "Elsie, will you have some meat?" asked her grandfather. "No," said her father, answering for her. "Once a day, as often as a child of her age ought to eat meat. She may have it at dinner, but never for breakfast or tea." The elder Mr. Dinsmore laughed, saying, "Really, Horace, I had no idea you were so notionate. I always allowed you to eat whatever you pleased, and I never saw that it hurt you. But of course you must manage your own child in your own way." "If you please, papa, I'd rather have some of those hot cakes," said Elsie timidly, as her father laid a slice of bread upon her plate. "No," he said decidedly, "I don't approve of hot bread for children. You must eat the cold." Then to a servant who was setting down a cup of coffee beside the little girl's plate, "Take that away, Pomp, and bring Miss Elsie a tumbler of milk. Or would you prefer water, Elsie?" "Milk, if you please, papa," she replied, with a little sigh, for she was extremely fond of coffee, and it was something of a trial to give it up. Her father put a spoonful of stewed fruit on her plate, and as Pompey set down a tumbler of rich milk beside it, said, "Now you have your breakfast before you, Elsie. Children in England are not allowed to eat butter until they are 10 or 11 years of age, and I think it's an excellent plan, to make them grow up rosy and healthy. I've neglected my little girl too long, but I intend to begin to take good care of her now," he added with a smile, and laying his hand for an instant upon her head. The slight caress and the few kind words were quite enough to reconcile Elsie to the rather meagre fare, and she ate it with a happy heart. But the meagre fare became a constant thing, while the caress and kind words were not, and though she submitted without a murmur, she could not help sometimes look with longing eyes at the coffee and hot buttered rolls, of which she was very fond. But she tried to be contented, saying to herself, "Papa knows best, and I ought to be satisfied with whatever he gives me." "Isn't it delightful to have your papa at home, Elsie?" Mr. Dinsmore one morning overheard Arthur saying to his little girl in the mocking tone. "It is very pleasant to live on bread and water, isn't it, eh?" "I don't live on bread and water," Elsie replied, a little indignantly. "Papa always allows me to have as much good, rich milk and cream and fruit as I want, or I can have eggs, or cheese, or honey, or anything else, except meat and hot cakes and butter and coffee; and who wouldn't rather do without such things all their lives than not to have a papa to love them? And besides, you know, Arthur, that I can have all the meat I want for dinner." "That's nothing, and I wouldn't give much for all the love you get from him," said Arthur scornfully. There was something like a sob from Elsie, and as her father rose and went to the window, he just caught a glimpse of her white dress disappearing down the garden walk. "What do you mean, sir, by teasing Elsie in that manner?" he exclaimed angrily to Arthur, who still stood where the little girl had left him, leaning against one of the pillars of the portico. "I only wanted to have a little fun," replied the boy doggedly. "Well, sir, I don't approve of such fun, and you will please to let the child alone in future," replied his brother, as he returned to his newspaper again. But somehow the paper had lost its interest. He seemed constantly to hear that little sob, and to see a little face all wet with tears and wounded feeling. Just then the school bell rang, and suddenly throwing down his paper, he took a card from his pocket, wrote a few words upon it, and calling a servant, said, "Take this to Miss Day." Elsie was seated at her desk, beginning her morning's work, when the servant entered and handed the card to the governess. Miss Day glanced at it and said, "Elsie, your father wants you. You may go." Elsie rose in some trepidation and left the room, wondering what her papa could want with her. "Where's my papa, Fanny?" she asked of the servant. "In the drawing room, Miss Elsie," was the reply, and she hastened to seek him there. He held out his hand as he entered, saying with a smile, "Come here, daughter." It was the first time he had called her that, and it sent a thrill of joy to her heart. She sprang to his side, and taking her hand in one of his, and laying the other gently on her head and bending it back a little, he looked keenly into her face. It was bright enough now, yet the traces of tears were very evident. "You've been crying," he said in a slightly reproving tone. "I'm afraid you do a great deal more of that than is good for you. It's a very babyish habit, and you must try to break yourself of it." The little face blushed painfully, and the eyes filled again. "There," he said, stroking her hair, "don't begin it again. I'm going to drive over to Ion, where your friend Mr. Travilla lives, to spend the day. Would my little daughter like to go with me?" "Oh, so very much, papa!" she answered eagerly. "There are no little folks there," he said, smiling; "nobody to see but Mr. Travilla and his mother. But I see you want to go, so run and ask Aunt Chloe to get you ready. Tell her I want you nicely dressed, and the carriage will be at the door in half an hour." Elsie bounded away to do his bidding, her face radiant with happiness, and at the specified time came down again, looking so very lovely that her father gazed at her with proud delight, and could not refrain from giving her a kiss as he lifted her up to place her in the carriage. Then seating himself beside her, he took her hand in his, and closing the door with the other, bade the coachman to drive on. "I suppose you've never been to Ion, Elsie?" he said inquiringly. "No, sir, but I have heard Aunt Adelaide say she thought it was a very pretty place," replied the little girl. "So it is, almost as pretty as Roseland," said her father. "Travilla and I have known each other from boyhood, and I spent many a happy day at Ion, and we went and had many boyish frolics together, before I ever thought of you." He smiled and patted her cheek as he spoke. Elsie's eyes sparkled. "Oh, papa," she said eagerly, "won't you tell me about those times? It seems so strange that you were ever a little boy, and I was nowhere." He laughed and said musingly, "It seems but a very little while to me, Elsie, since I was no older than you are now." He heaved a sigh and relapsed into silence. Elsie wished very much that he would grant her request, but did not dare disturb him by speaking a word, and they rode on quietly for some time, until a squirrel darting up a tree caught her eye, and she uttered an exclamation. "Oh, papa, did you see that squirrel? Look at him now, perched up on that branch. There, we've passed the tree, and now he's out of sight." This reminded Mr. Dinsmore of a day he had spent in those woods hunting squirrels when quite a boy, and he gave Elsie an animated account of it. One of the incidents of the day had been the accidental discharge of the fowling piece of one of his young companions, close at Horace Dinsmore's side, missing him by but a hair's breadth. "I felt faint and sick when I knew how near I'd been to death," he said, as he finished his narrative. Elsie had been listening with breathless interest. "Dear papa," she murmured, laying her little cheek against his hand, "how good God was to spare your life! If you had been killed, I could never have had you for my papa." "Perhaps you would have had much a better one, Elsie," he said gravely. "Oh, no, papa, I wouldn't want any other," she replied earnestly, pressing his hands to her lips. "Ah, here we are!" exclaimed her father, as at this instant the carriage turned into a broad avenue, up which they drove quite rapidly, and the next moment they had stopped. The coachman had thrown open the carriage door, and Mr. Dinsmore, springing out, lifted his little girl in his arms and set her down on the steps of the veranda. "Ah, Dinsmore, how do you do? Glad to see you, and my little friend Elsie too. Why, this is really kind," cried Mr. Travilla, in his cheerful, hearty way, as, hurrying out to welcome them, he shook Mr. Dinsmore cordially by the hand and kissed Elsie's cheek. Walk in," he continued, leading the way into the house. "My mother will be delighted to see you both, Miss Elsie especially, for she seemed to take quite a great fancy to her." If Mrs. Travilla's greeting was less boisterous, it certainly was not lacking in cordiality, and she made Elsie feel at home at once, taking off her bonnet, smoothing her hair, and kissing her affectionately. The gentlemen soon went out together, and Elsie spent this morning in Mrs. Travilla's room, chatting with her and assisting her with some coarse garments she was making for her servants. Mrs. Travilla was an earnest Christian, and the lady and the little girl were not long in discovering the tie which existed between them. Miss Travilla, being also a woman of great discernment, and having known Horace Dinsmore nearly all his life, had conceived a very little correct idea of the trials and difficulties of Elsie's situation, and without alluding to them at all, gave her some most excellent advice, which the little girl received very thankfully. They were still chatting together when Mr. Travilla came in, saying, "Come, Elsie, I want to take you out to see my garden, hothouse, etc. We will just have time before dinner. Will you go along, mother?" "No, I have some little matters to attend to before dinner, and will leave you to do the honors," replied the lady, and taking the little girl's hand, he led her out. "Where's papa?" asked Elsie. "Oh, he's in the library, looking over some new books," replied Mr. Travilla. "He's always cared more for books than anything else. But what do you think of my flowers?" "Oh, they are lovely." "What a variety you have! What a splendid Cape jessamine that is! And there is a variety of cactus I never saw before. Oh, you have a great many more, and handsomer, I think, than we have at Roselands," exclaimed Elsie, as she passed admiringly from one to the other. Mr. Travilla was much pleased with the admiration she expressed, for he was very fond of his flowers, and took great pride in showing them. But soon they were called in to dinner, where Elsie was seated by her father. "I hope this little girl has not given you any trouble, Mrs. Travilla," said he, looking gravely at her. "Oh, no," the lady hastened to say, "I have enjoyed her company very much indeed, and hope you will bring her again to see me very soon." After dinner, as the day was very warm, they adjourned to the veranda, which was the coolest place to be found, it being on the shady side of the house, and also protected by thick trees, underneath which a beautiful fountain was playing. But the conversation was upon some subject which did not interest Elsie, and she presently stole away to the library, and seating herself in the corner on the sofa, was soon lost to everything around her in the intense interest with which she was reading a book she had taken from the table. "Ah, that is what you are about, Miss Elsie, a bookworm just like your father, I see. I have been wondering what had become of you for the last 2 hours," exclaimed Mr. Travilla's pleasant voice. And sitting down beside her, he took the book from her hand, and putting it behind him, said, "Put it away now. You will have time enough to finish it, and I want you to talk with me." "Oh, please let me have it," she pleaded. "I shall not have much time, for papa will soon be calling me to go home." "No, no, he is not going to take you away. I've made a bargain with him to let me keep you," said Mr. Travilla very gravely. "We both think that there are children enough at Roselands without you, and so your papa has given you to me, and you are to be my little girl and call me papa in future." Elsie gazed earnestly in his face for an instant, saying in a half frightened tone, "You are only joking, Mr. Travilla." "Not a bit of it," he said. "Can't you see that I'm in earnest?" His tone and look were both so serious that for an instant Elsie believed he meant all he was saying, and springing to her feet with a little cry of alarm, she hastily withdrew her hand which he had taken, and rushed out to the veranda, where her father still sat, conversing with Mrs. Travilla. She flung herself into his arms, and clinging to him, hid her face in his breast, sobbing, "Oh, papa, dear papa, don't give me away, please don't. I'll be so good. I'll do everything you bid me. "Why, Elsie, what does this mean?" exclaimed Mr. Dinsmore in great surprise and perplexity, while Mr. Travilla stood in the doorway, looking half amused, half sorry for what he had done. "Oh, papa!" sobbed the little girl, still clinging to him as though fearing she would be torn away from his arms. "Mr. Travilla says you have given me to him. Oh, papa, don't give me away." "Nonsense, Elsie, I'm ashamed of you. How can you be so very silly as to believe for one moment anything so perfectly absurd as that I would think of giving you away? Why, I would as soon think of parting with my eyes." Elsie raised her head and gazed searchingly into his face, then with a deep drawn sigh of relief, dropped it again, saying, "Oh, I am so glad." "Really, Elsie," said Travilla, coming up and patting her on the shoulder, "I can't say that I feel much complimented, and indeed I don't see why you need to have been so very much distressed at the prospect before you, for I must say I have vanity enough to imagine that I should make the better, or at least the more indulgent father of the two. Come now, wouldn't you be willing to try me for a month, if your papa will give consent?" Elsie shook her head. "I will let you have your way in everything," argued Travilla coaxingly, "and I know that is more than he does." "I don't want my own way, Mr. Travilla. I know it wouldn't always be a good way," replied Elsie decidedly. Her father laughed, and passed his hand caressingly over her curls. "I thought you liked me, little Elsie," said Travilla in a tone of disappointment. "So I do, Mr. Travilla. I like you very much," she replied. "Well, don't you think I'd make a good father?" "I'm sure you'd be very kind, and that I should love you very much, but not so much as I love my own papa, because, you know, you are not my papa, and never can be, even if he should give me to you." Mr. Dinsmore laughed heartily, saying, "I think you may as well give it up, Travilla. It seems I'll have to keep her, whether or no, for she clings to me like a leech." "Well, Elsie, you will at least come to the piano and play a little for me, will you not?" asked Travilla, smiling. But Elsie clung to her father, seeming loath to leave him, until he said in a grave, decided way, "Go, Elsie, go at once, and do as you requested." She rose instantly to obey. Travilla looked somewhat vexed. "I wish," he afterward remarked to his mother, "that Dinsmore was not quite so ready to second my requests with commands. I want Elsie's compliance to be voluntary, else I think it is worth very little." Elsie played and sung until they were called to tea, after which she sat quietly by her father's side, listening to the conversation of her elders until the carriage was announced. "Well, my daughter," said Mr. Dinsmore, when they were fairly upon their way to Roselands, "have you had a pleasant day?" "Oh, very pleasant, papa, excepting—" She paused, looking a little embarrassed. "Well, excepting what?" he asked, smiling down at her. "Excepting when Miss Travilla frightened me so, papa," she replied, moving closer to his side, blushing and casting down her eyes. "And you do love your own papa best, and don't want to exchange him for another?" he said inquiringly, as he passed his arm affectionately around her waist. "Oh, no, dear papa, not for anybody else in all the world," she said earnestly. He made no reply in words, but, looking highly gratified, bent down and kissed her cheek. He did not speak again during the ride, but when the carriage stopped he lifted her out, and setting her down gently, bade her a kind good night, saying it was time for mammy to put her to bed. She ran lightly upstairs, and springing into her nurse's arms, exclaimed, "Oh, mammy, mammy, what a pleasant day I have ever had! Papa's been so kind, and so were Mr. Travilla and his mother." "I'se berry glad, darlin', and I hope you gwine have many more such days," replied Chloe, embracing her fondly, and then proceeding to take off her bonnet and prepare her for bed, while Elsie gave her a minute account of all the occurrences of the day, not omitting the fright which Mr. Travilla had given her, and how happy her fears had been relieved. "You look berry happy, my darlin' pet," said Chloe, clasping her nursling again in her arms when her task was finished. "Yes, mammy, I am happy, oh so happy, because I do believe that papa is beginning to love me a little, and I hope that perhaps after a while he will love me very much." The tears gathered in her eyes as she spoke. The next afternoon, as Elsie was returning from her walk, she met her father. "Elsie," said he in a reproving tone, "I have forbidden you to walk out alone. Are you disobeying me?" "No, papa," she replied meekly, raising her eyes to his face. "I was not alone until about 5 minutes ago, when Aunt Adelaide and Louise left me. They said it did not matter, and I was so near to home, and they were going to make a call, and did not want me along." "Very well," he said, holding her hand and making her walk by his side. "How far have you been?" "We went down to the river bank to the big springs, papa. I believe it is a little more than a mile away, but when we came home we made it shorter by coming across some of the fields and through the meadow." "Through the meadow?" said Mr. Dinsmore. "Don't go there again, Elsie, unless I give you express permission." "Why, papa?" she asked, looking up at him in some surprise. "Because I forbid it," he said sternly. "That is quite enough for you to know. All you have to do is obey, and you never need to ask me why when I give you an order." Elsie's eyes filled, and a big tear rolled quickly down her cheek. "I didn't mean to be naughty, papa," she said, struggling to keep down a sob, "and I will try never to ask why again." "There is another thing," said he. "You cry quite too easily. It is entirely too babyish for a girl of your age, and you must quit it." "I will try, papa," said the little girl, wiping her eyes, and making a great effort to control her feelings. They had entered the avenue while this conversation was going on, and were now drawing near the house, and just at that moment a little girl about Elsie's age came running to meet them, exclaiming, "Oh, Elsie, I'm glad you've come at last. We've been here an whole hour, mamma and Herbert and I've been looking for you all this time." "How do you do, Miss Lucy Carrington? I can see you can talk as fast as ever," said Mr. Dinsmore, laughing and holding out his hand. Lucy took it, saying with a little pout, "To be sure, Mr. Dinsmore, it isn't more than 2 or 3 weeks since you were at our house, and I wouldn't forget how to talk in that time." Then looking at Elsie, she went on, "We've come to stay a week. Won't we have a fine time?" And catching her friend around the waist, she gave her a hearty squeeze. "I hope so," said Elsie, returning the embrace. "I'm glad you've come." "Is your papa here, Miss Lucy?" asked Mr. Dinsmore. "Yes, sir, but he's going home again tonight, and then he'll come back for us next week." "I must go in and speak to him," said Mr. Dinsmore. "Elsie, do you entertain Lucy?" "Yes, sir, I will," said Elsie. "Come with me to my room, won't you, Lucy?" "Yes, but won't you speak to mamma first, and Herbert too? You were such a favorite with them both, and they still are in the dressing room, for mamma is not very well, and was quite fatigued with her ride." Lucy led the way to her mamma's room as she spoke, Elsie following. "Ah, Elsie, dear, how do you do? I'm delighted to see you," said Mrs. Carrington, rising from the sofa as they entered. Then drawing the little girl closer to her, she passed her arms affectionately around her waist, and kissed her several times. "I suppose you are very happy now that your papa has come home at last," she said, looking searchingly into Elsie's face. "I remember you used to be looking forward so to his return, constantly talking of it and longing for it." Poor Elsie, conscious that her father's presence had not brought with it the happiness she had anticipated, and yet unwilling to acknowledge the fact or tell an untruth, was at loss of what to say. But she was relieved by the necessity of replying by Herbert, Lucy's twin brother, a pale, sickly looking boy, who had several years suffered from a hip complaint. "Oh, Elsie!" he exclaimed, catching hold of her hand and squeezing it between both of his, "I'm ever so glad to see you again." "Yes," said Mrs. Carrington, "Herbert always says nobody can tell him such beautiful stories as Elsie; and nobody but his mother and his old mammy was half so kind to run and wait on him when he was laid on his back for so many weeks. He missed you very much when we went home, and often wished he was at Roselands again." "How's your hip now, Herbert?" asked Elsie, looking pityingly at the boy's pale face. "Oh, a great deal better, thank you. I can take quite long walks sometimes now, though I still limp, and cannot run and leap like other boys." They chatted a few moments longer, and then Elsie went to her room to have her hat taken off, and her hair made smooth before the tea bell should ring. End of chapter 4, part 1.